All right, in this video, I'm going to show you how I mastered being able to draw dynamic figures in a 5-step way. I like to do this step by step because then you guys will understand better how to take a concept that is simple and then apply that concept in the next step that has a little bit more complexity, and then so on and so on. I think most of you, when you start drawing, the thing you do wrong is you learn a simple thing and then you try to make it as complex as possible. A good example of this is learning about boxes and then trying to draw anatomy. I see this so many times, and there's many intermediate steps that you can take to get to that level in a much more streamlined way. And again, drawing dynamic figures is the exact same way. So we're going to get into it. Number one is actually very easy, but a lot of you guys don't actually do it. And I call this pushing form. It's just basically pushing form dynamically. This will be your first intro into dynamic figures. It's not the figures itself, it's pushing the forms that make up the figure. So that means that you're going to do things like just the cylinder, but you're going to like push it, right? This is part of as well what we call form manipulation at Artwod, but you can also, call it dynamic forms. It's what you want to call it, but we sort of apply a method to it where you're bending things, you're tapering things, you're twisting things. All of this creates manipulated form, and that also goes into dynamic form. So you can take a cylinder like this, you can also push it in like perspective, so you can have like a top down, and you're like, okay, I'm really going to push this cylinder into perspective. You can do the same for a box where it's not just a box, you're like really pushing that thing to its max, so that you're already starting to understand how to push and pull form and create more dynamic nature into that. And then eventually what you do is you start combining those things together, right? And you can already see we're starting to create a figure, but that's not the point of step one. The point of step one is just pushing and pulling form dynamically. And don't worry about proportions, don't worry about accuracy. Just worry about making it look dynamic. Again, the secret sauce to my teaching is getting rid of as many variables as you can when you're learning a specific thing so that you create focus and then you really understand that and take it with you to the next principle. So, what's the next principle? Well, for me, it's basically doing the same thing as we're doing in step one. However, we're now going to use lines of action. Now, I'm not going to explain all of the lines of action, and I'm not going to pretend like I know everything about lines of action. But for me, I only use 2 types of line of action, which is essentially the head with the spine and the legs. That's all I do. So what does that look like? Well, I start with a head like this. I attach a spine to it that is dynamic, and then I might attach legs to it like this. That's all I do. And I do it in a sweeping motion so that the lines itself stay dynamic. Now, I want to point out that at this point, your figures do not need to look accurate yet. It's good that you understand the figure itself. So if you understand the basic figure, that's sort of a prerequisite to get into any of this anyway. But you don't really have to draw an accurate figure for all I care. Okay, and I'm not going to do that as well in this step. I'm just going to, I know like, okay, there's a box attached to the rib cage, so I'm going to follow that a little bit, and there might be like a little cylinder for the abdomen like this, and then I might indicate the pelvis, and what I'm really going to do is I'm just going to push the forms that I understand. I can freely fill in how I want to add dynamic forms to the lines of action. So there's a bit of a creative license, and the only thing that you want to do is actually, again, just focus on the dynamic nature of these lines. So I'm just going to do a couple of things, maybe like this, and there's no accuracy here, by the way, right? This figure might not even exist or be able to exist. I can do the same with the arms that I just add in later. I'm not really worried about accuracy or doing something that looks very believable. At this point, I'm just trying to push and pull form as best as I can. And again, what this really will help you do is you will no longer focus on trying to make things look good. You'll just focus on the thing you need to focus on, which is creating dynamic form. We can get accuracy later, especially when we're working digitally. We can push and pull however we like. The reason you want to do this is to have a singular focus and get better at that, and actually not even get better, just get more confidence, because a lot of good drawings just come from confidence and a relaxation of the mind. If you're too stressed about getting a result, that's when you make most of your errors. So again, just worry about like a line of action, get a head in there, you know, something like this, add a spine to it. So that's the head with the spine, and then maybe add like, I don't know, really push the legs, for instance, like this. And then again, you just start adding form to it. So it could be the rib cage going into the pelvis, going into the legs, like this. Right? All I'm trying to do is be more dynamic with those forms. That's all I'm doing. Then we get into step 3. Now in step 3, what we're going to do is we're just going to look at poses, existing poses, and we're going to push the pose itself, again, using what we've learned in step 1 and step 2. And we're also going to push the perspective. Now, if you don't know perspective, that's a bit of an issue. If you have spatial awareness, it's much better because you can really just push and be more creative with how you want to, you know, push things into space. And you can push it in terms of like the perspective, or you can push it in terms of the axes in the three-dimensional space, essentially. So you can push and pull a lot of things, but in step 3, that's what we want to focus on. So we want to create something like a character, and we want to take that character. Let's say we're looking at a standing neutral pose. We want to take that character and then essentially push it. So we want to maybe do more of a top down pose where, again, we are, right, this is like the neck, and then again we are taking the rib cage, but we're exaggerating that rib cage because we did that with the spine, right? We're basically following the spine downward like this. And then also we want to do it in like maybe a 3-point perspective. So we want to do it downward and then also push it in terms of perspective like this. Right? So something, you know, as seemingly simple as this can become very complex in the beginning. So I'm not even worried about anatomy here at all. I'm just worried about, again, looking at a pose, trying to push that pose, trying to push it just dynamically and in perspective. So you're keeping the pose as you see it, and then you push it. And start with neutral poses and then try to do more exaggerated action poses. So look at real life action reference packs and try to push those, because that's essentially what they do in animation as well. And you can, again, do that with what you've learned in step 1 and step 2, because that's essential. You want to have those building blocks and that confidence before you start pushing things. And this is where I think a lot of you get it wrong, is you learn a neutral anatomy figure, you learn anatomy, very complex, you try to make your mannequins very complex already, and then you try to make all of that complexity dynamic. So you're trying to push everything at once. And that's almost like trying to drive a car for the first time or for the first few times, and you're still worried about, when do I hit the brake? When do I accelerate? When do I switch gears? How do I pay attention to traffic? And then you immediately go racing. That's kind of what you're trying to do. And that's not what you should be doing. You should have a very intuitive sense of everything. And the intuitive sense that you want to sort of first attain is of simplicity. So simple characters, simple mannequins. Push that. Then make that character a bit more complex and push that again. So that kind of goes into step 4 for me, is once you can do step 1, 2, and 3, then you might want to add a bit of complexity. Then you want to add maybe a bit of anatomical indication depending on your knowledge. So something, like this. These are still studies from mine, but you want to do something like this, where you start pushing the figure and you're doing it with your understanding of anatomy. So you're trying to also include anatomy, or at least your understanding of anatomy, on top of that figure. That's step 4. That's essentially it. You don't need to worry about trying to learn anatomy in that step. Again, in this case, or in this video, we're focusing on just creating dynamic characters. So create them within the limit of your understanding of the figure. But when you go and add complexity, add it to the degree that you understand it. And then that brings us to the last step, which is step 5. And in step 5, what we're going to do is, once we have a bit of complexity added to our figure, we're now going to try and push the design as much as we can. That means we're going to add a couple of things. A lot of dynamism, especially in figures, is going to come from the features that are most animated on figures, which are expression, hands, and the body itself. So we can push the design by pushing hands. So we need an understanding of hands, of course, but again, within the degree to which complexity you understand it. And then we want to also push the design. And pushing the design is a really good one for you to also train on a complexity that you understand. Again, I cannot stress this enough. You always want to work within your framework of understanding. If you're always trying to learn new things, using things you don't even understand yet, you're going to have a hard time. All right. So always focus on one thing. Again, get rid of as many variables as you can, and then try pushing it. And so then for step 5, what I end up doing is I'm just trying to really push that design within, again, my framework of knowledge of what I can understand from the figure based on its anatomy, its structure, what I know of perspective, and then I'm just trying to push those shapes. Can I push maybe the form of the shoulder a bit? Can I exaggerate it? Can I use straights versus curves to maybe create a more pleasing effect? Can I still push the curvature and the dynamic nature of the forms with more anatomical indication? So again, we pushed it with simple form, but I'm trying to push it equally hard with more anatomical form. And it's the same sort of principle. We're just creating a form that is a little bit more complex. And for you, that might be just a bit more complex than a cylinder. But for me, that might be something that looks fairly anatomical, but I'm still thinking about the exact same structure. I'm just trying to push it more than maybe you would. And then you rinse and repeat. You start from step 1, going to step 2, step 3, step 4, and step 5. At some point, you might be able to skip step 1 because you don't need to really push those simple forms anymore. You can just go into step 2, push that curvature, that line of action, and with that, you can already start adding anatomical detail on top of it and really pushing your figure forward. And then you can start again experimenting with the design of that anatomical indication. And that's, for me at least, that's what really worked to better understand how to create more dynamic poses. And a lot of you that are beginners looking at this, step 1 is crucial for you. It's the one that you probably skip most as well. It's what we see as well with people that don't understand form manipulation, is everyone tries to go from a cylinder to an abdomen or an arm. And there's a disconnect there. You need to understand how to manipulate form, how to push form, how to make it more dynamic before that goes into something that is anatomically complex. All right? So with that said, try to apply this 5-step process and see if you get better results. I'm sure you will. And do remember, try to do that consistently and you will definitely get better. All right? Have fun.